My name is Ryan Cymbor, and the country I'm reporting on is China. For China's political background, they are ruled by the Chinese Communist Party, which I'll be referring to as the CCP. The CCP dominates all political life in China, which makes China a communist republic. While there are 8 other independent non-communist parties, they must accept the CCP's leadership to exist, and their actions are closely supervised, which gives the CCP full rule over China. The leader of China is President Xi Jinping. He currently has the most individual power that China has seen in decades. In 2018, he was reelected to his second 5-year term, and in the same year, the 2-term limit was abolished, so he could theoretically remain president for life, which is something that hasn't been seen since Mao Zedong ruled for decades. Women in China have very little political representation. China has a 24.9% women in parliament rate, but most of the women in parliament hold very low positions and are very underrepresented in top CCP positions. And China is one of the world's most media restrictive countries. Chinese authorities suppress and censor a lot of information, and the Central Propaganda Department also banned any unlicensed individuals from posting news-related content earlier this year, which increases the risk for the public to comment on any news or current affairs. As far as the economy, China is an economic powerhouse that plays a major global role. Some of their biggest industries are mining and ore processing, as well as manufacturing and agriculture. Some of the biggest agricultural products that China produces are rice, millet, and maize. Millet is a cereal crop that's used in many breads and fermented beverages. And China's economy leads to a relatively low unemployment rate of 3.64%, which ranks 52nd in the world. This is slightly lower of an unemployment rate than the U.S. has, and only 6% of the population is below the poverty line. As far as slavery and prostitution, China's huge economy is built on the back of cheap, labor-intensive goods, which are created under modern slavery conditions. The Global Slavery Index estimates that on any given day in 2016, there were over 3.8 million people living in conditions of modern slavery in China, which is 2.8 victims for every 1,000 people in the country. And then trafficking is also very common in China. Traffickers will use fake job opportunities to lure Chinese women as well as women from neighboring countries. And then once the women are lured and abducted, they're forced into sexual exploitation or forced marriage. This is a result of a gender imbalance in China, which leads to a higher demand of brides for men. Thankfully, the government is noticing and taking positive steps like creating victim assistance programs, closing legislative loopholes that may allow traffickers to run free, and introducing more legislature to prevent trafficking. The biggest example of violence against women in China is domestic violence, which affects a quarter of Chinese women. The first law to specifically target domestic violence in China wasn't created until 2015. And domestic violence in China is seen as an expected part of private family life. So victims are urged to set aside their abuse to save the family. And since violence is considered a private family matter, it prevents help from stepping in. So female victims are expected to remain committed in relationships, as separation of the family violates some of the higher values of family unity in China. And when couples attempt mediation, victims are more likely to give inaccurate recounts of the events out of fear, which will lead to the dismissal of many cases. So the greatest thing here that could help is education of equality and modern-day ideals from a young age. As for maternal health, this is one of the most positive things for women in China. The maternal mortality ratio is down 60 deaths per 100,000 births in the past 27 years. It's down to around 18 deaths per 100,000 births. In 2016, China implemented a series of strategies to reduce the MMR. These include pregnancy risk screening and assessment strategy, case-by-case management strategy for high-risk pregnancies, referral and treatment strategy for critically ill pregnant women and newborns, reporting strategy for maternal deaths, and an accountability strategy. So by 2030, in the Healthy China 2030 plan, the goal is to be down to 12 deaths per 100,000 births, from the current level, like I mentioned, about 18. The Chinese government has invested 8.48 billion RMB, which is the Chinese currency, into the infrastructure of maternal and child health care institutions across the country. And this is a huge positive for women in China. As for education, academic freedom is heavily restricted. The CCP appoints top university officials, which means that the most powerful people in China's universities have been approved by the Chinese Communist Party, which makes sure that these teachers and professors are thoroughly trained in upholding their communist agenda. Xi Jinping thought is something that's a required component of the curriculum at all levels of education, which means that the communist values and ideas of the president are taught even at the lowest levels of education, which instills them in children from a very young age. As far as women in China and their education, it's unfair. Women must post higher exam scores. So if a man and a woman were to post the same score, the man would most likely be the one admitted into the university. And in rural areas where there's a lack of good education and a lack of money, if a family can only afford to send one child to school, it will most likely be a son instead of a daughter. However, education for women in China is looking up. As of 2012, the length of the average girl's education in China increased to 8.6 years, which is only 0.7 years less than the average man's education in China. There's currently more than 20 million women in science and technology in China, and women even have higher enrollment levels in higher education. As for humanitarian groups, they must be under the leadership of the CCP to be considered official. And in recent years, China has cracked down on civil society, which makes it very difficult for humanitarian groups. And any independent humanitarian group faces a lot of danger, like censorship, getting suppressed, and even detainment and sentences. One example is the founders of an anti-discrimination group in China, which was unofficial and not led by the CCP. They were sentenced to 2 to 5 years in prison with a private trial just for founding an anti-discrimination group. And this leads to an endless struggle of trying to make a change, because it's difficult for humanitarian groups to make a change under the CCP leadership. So while China is on the right track in many aspects like maternal health and the economy, there's still a lot of negative that tends to go unnoticed. Prostitution and modern slavery are very present. Ethnic conflict exists in millions, and women aren't quite on equal footing as far as education is concerned. And now that President Xi Jinping has the potential to stay in power for life, the future of China and women in China remains unclear. Thank you for listening, and here are my sources.